The Ad Hoc Committee on Gang Violence and Youth Development will now come to order. We have 2 items on the agenda, and at this time I'll announce that item number 2 will be postponed to next week's meeting. We anticipate that we will have a meeting of this committee next Tuesday, and we anticipate putting it on the agenda. I want to make sure that the mayor's office understands that we do have some questions, and they need to send the most appropriate person who can answer the most intricate questions about that proposal, which has to do with the JAG award. Okay, so please note that. And it's my understanding that one of the city attorneys is out on a personal matter. That would probably be one of the people helpful in answering some of those questions as well. So we'll postpone that item number 2 from the agenda to next week. With that, that leaves item number 1 on the agenda, and we'll open up with item number 1.
Item number 1, communication from the mayor and CAO report relative to selection of gang reduction youth development zones, initiative prevention services providers, implementation of operations in connection with the fiscal year 2008-09 gang reduction youth development program and related matters.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations to the mayor's office. This is one of the big steps in being the go-to place when it comes to intervention and prevention and issues for the city of Los Angeles. We have on the agenda today we're going to be discussing the RFP process and results for the prevention contracts that I wouldn't say are mirrored in any way, but before those type of contracts with the city of Los Angeles were handled out of CDD, and now they'll be handled out of the mayor's office. So with that, if you'd like to open with an explanation or presentation before I ask questions.
Yes, Beryl Taylor from the CEO's office.
First name again?
Beryl.
Okay.
Essentially, the report before you provides recommendations to select 6 contractors for to provide gang prevention services in 6 gang reduction and youth development zones. The contracts would be for a term of 1 year with options to renew for 2 additional years. And the proposed contractors were selected as a result of the request for proposals issued by the mayor's office in April 2008. The proposed total contract amount is $3 million with $500,000 per gang reduction and youth development zone. Funding for the contract is available in the 2008-09 adopted budget and from 3 federal grants. The selected contractors are Community Build for Baldwin Village Southwest, Children's Hospital for Cypress Park Northeast, Los Angeles Metropolitan Churches for Florence, Graham, People Coordinated Services for Newton, Arniedo, Family Centers for Pacoima Foothill, and Violence Intervention Program for Ramona Hills. We recommend approval of the 6 contractors, and the mayor's office is here to answer questions with regards to the RFP process and the selection process.
Okay.
Yeah, Reverend Jeff Carr, the Director of Gang Reduction and Youth Development for the mayor. And just a few things in terms of the process, as Beryl said. On April 15th, we actually issued a request for proposal for the 6 areas, the grids areas. We did release a total of $3 million, $500,000 per each grid zone, which comes from both the city's general fund dollars, which was approved in the 08-09 budget, as well as from three federal grants. The 6 zones that we have started with are actually the Baldwin Village Southwest grid zone, Cypress Park Northeast, Florence Graham 77th in Newton, Pacoima Foothill, and Ramona Gardens in Hollenbeck. And just as a footnote, we actually, before the release of the proposals, we actually had needs assessments that were conducted by 3 contractors, the Advancement Project, Cal State University Los Angeles, and Harder & Company. did 6 needs assessments, which were integral to the RFP process. And the purpose of those needs assessment was really to help identify the specific components of the gang problem, analyze their causes, and also to identify resources that were currently available in the area as well as those that were needed. I think they did a pretty extensive process, talking with folks in the community, getting data, and making that an integral part of our process. The RFP process, actually, each application was rigorously reviewed. We had a multi-tiered review process that included independent expert evaluators who really judged these on merit, history of success, innovation, and experience in serving the target population. The RFP selection process actually included 3 levels of review, which included a local panel review of written applications, a comprehensive review of 2 top scoring proposals by our Oversight Committee to ensure consistency across all sites, and then interviews of all top 2 scoring proposals. We actually also conducted an appeals process where each agency was given the opportunity to submit a request for an appeal and present their case before the appeals board. Actually, a total of 12 requests were submitted. 7 of those appeals were granted or accepted, 5 were denied, and scores for 3 of the agencies who appealed were actually modified. Agencies were notified in writing of the mayor's final funding recommendations, and we are asking that this committee accept our recommendations to negotiate and execute contracts with these 6 organizations to provide gang prevention services and to forward to the City Council for consideration.
Okay, thank you. First of all, you mentioned that it involves general fund and some grants. For example, it appears that Cypress Park Northeast, which is one area, one zone, Florence Graham 77th, which is another zone, Newton is another zone, and Pacoima Foothill is another zone. Those 4 apparently are all for these prevention contracts. Those 4 are general funded. Right?
That's
general
correct.
fund funded. Now, you mentioned 3 grants. I only have 2 that I've identified outside of that. And for example, the Baldwin Village Southwest is $100,000 of general fund and $400,000 from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Is there another grant involved in that area?
Yeah, in the Florence Graham 77th, that's the entire amount there comes from the 2007 Edward Byrne Memorial Discretionary Grant. That's actually in the CAO's
Yes, I'm sorry.
report.
Yes, we have that correct.
And then in the Ramona Gardens grid zone, there's actually $400,044 that's coming from the 2006 Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistant Grant. So that's the 3 different ones there.
Okay, but 2 of those grants have the same name. It's
Right.
just 2 different years.
That's
Okay.
right.
Got
That's
it.
right.
Because I only had 2 different kinds of grants.
That's correct.
So there are 2 different kinds of grants, but one grant is for '06 funding and one is for '07, but it's still the Byrne Memorial Grant.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Now, which 12-month period are these contracts for?
We're asking for authority to be able to make them retroactive to August 1st and to go through July 31st of next year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So basically, ideally, it would have probably been July 1st through June 30th, but
Yeah.
the reality is we're probably 30 days off of the ideal. So,
That's correct.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, what I want the public to understand is through the transition process and the new process that we have with the city, where the vast majority of these kinds of services are going to be rendered through the mayor's office instead of CDD, we do have what I would call a transition going on right now, where Bridges 1 and Bridges 2 contracts are still rolling forward through the first 6 months of this fiscal year, correct?
That's correct.
So in effect, we are rendering, I hope, that the net result on the streets between July 1st of this year and December 31st of this year, if everything goes right, we will have rendered more services to our constituents, at least through the first 6 months of this fiscal year.
Yeah, that would be correct on a couple different accounts. One would be, as you suggest, with these additional funds that are outside those bridges contracts, and then As you might recall, Councilman, the City Council about 6 or 8 weeks ago actually authorized an additional $600,000 to augment Bridges 2 funding for the summer. And we've already actually executed those contracts, and contractors have received those funds, and the work is actually being done this summer.
Okay.
So there is, in fact, more dollars on the street.
So, I don't want to overplay the truth, but the truth of the matter is it looks like for the summer of 2008, for these 3 months, we will have definitely augmented the services rendered to these communities.
Yeah, through the $600,000, and not just these
But
communities.
the
actually.
600,000 plus, for example, on its prevention funds, beginning, let me just make sure, retroactive August 1st, that means that we will have, compared to last year, for
That's
example,
correct. Yeah.
we will or should have rendered more services in these 3 months of this summer, more or August and September this summer, vastly more than last year.
Yeah, and I think with these dollars actually moving forward into the fall through the end of this year, that would be true.
And then after the summer, there will still be Bridges 1 or / prevention funds in addition to the funds in these contracts, at least for the first 6 months of this fiscal year.
Yeah, those were essentially extended at the current level or the previous year's levels of funding prorated on a 6-month basis. So those funds are staying constant as they were last year for prevention, intervention, and for safe passages. We just extended those out 6 months. And then the $600,000 additional that came from the council for the summer months was specifically for intervention. And that was not just in the grid zones, that actually was for citywide.
But the thing is, it just occurred to me as we're having this dialogue, we're going to have a snapshot of 6 months where I would hope and expect that there's complementary activity going on in these communities with the system we're transitioning to or implementing and the system we had before and the services from all of the above. But we've never talked about looking at that and seeing how what kind of effect that's going to have on services rendered in these communities. It didn't even dawn on me until we're having this dialogue that we're going to have an interesting snapshot in time that we've never had in the city that I'm aware of.
Well, as part of the Bridges 1 contracts as prevention, as part of these closeout contracts, there is a requirement for the agencies to have a plan for how to transition clients off of those contracts, because obviously they'll be ending in December. So certainly one way, if the young people who might be presently being served on a Bridges 1 contract were assessed as being at risk still of joining gangs, that certainly would make sense that you would want to make a transition for some of those young people to actually be potentially enrolled in the new gang reduction, youth development, prevention programs that are going forward. That's not a requirement, but it certainly is something that could happen.
But the thing is, right now, the entity within the city, for those 6 months, to look back at those 6 months, first and foremost, is the mayor's office.
Well, we are actually, we're actually now, the Community Development Department worked with our office to actually negotiate and develop the contracts for the final 6 months of Bridges. We then executed those contracts, and now our office will actually be monitoring those contracts as we move forward over the course of the last 6 months.
But I don't know how we forgot to do this or forgot to have this dialogue. But what we're going to have to ask of the mayor's office is a dialogue at the end of those 6 months, sometime subsequent to those 6 months, of not only the transition aspect of it, but just the basic services rendered during that snapshot in time. Do you get what I'm saying?
I think so. I mean, if you're just wondering, if this isn't exactly...
We and you have already identified that there's going to be a transition. And some agencies, names, and organizations did not get these contracts, but were in fact rendering prevention services in the communities, et cetera. So that aspect, we all realize that there's going to be a transition.
Right.
But what I'm talking about is, was there any any net benefit when it comes to public safety and when it comes to violence amongst these youth, because when you look at the dollars spent on a month-to-month basis during this 6-month period, we're going to have infused more into those communities than we did ever before. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's been staring us in the face, this window of time, but I've never thought to ask the question, how are we going to go ahead and memorialize that period of time, and will we have learned anything from that beyond the transition aspect of it? Yeah. We all recognize that there's a transition learning period here because it is transitional, but we're also putting more resources into these communities. I don't want to call it inadvertent, but we're putting more resources into these communities for a window of time.
Yeah, I mean, we do expect the agencies, the 6 agencies that are being recommended here, will actually have some period of time of ramping up in terms of hiring staff once we are able to negotiate contracts, and then beginning recruiting young people, assessing them for their risk factors related to gang joining, and then actually enrolling them in the program. So the time may be somewhat smaller. It may be a smaller snapshot than the entire 6 months, obviously, that we're looking at. But there will, in fact, probably be some overlap in terms of when you would actually have young people being served. We can certainly look at, how many young people, that's one of the things we'll be tracking, how many young people are being served through the LA Bridges final 6-month contracts, as well as the young people that are being served. But you're going to have one, if you think of it this way, one group of contractors who are now starting to transition young people to other things, going this way towards December 31st, and then another 6 contractors who are ramping up to starting to take kids in. So you will have sort of 2 different things moving in opposite directions.
And the interesting overlay on what you just described is the previous Bridges 1 contractors during this 6-month period are still rendering services, even though part of their energy is going toward transition and getting the community familiarized with the fact that there's going to be other organizations servicing them, et cetera. But during that period of time, they're still rendering some services.
That's correct.
That's expected of them. So I'm just letting you know, as it's going through my head, we're going to probably ask of the mayor's office sometime in the near future that subsequent to January 1st that we come back to that. I know we got a lot going on, but we come back to that and then figure out how we can memorialize that for the record, how that went.
Sure.
Okay. All right. That wasn't in my notes. It just dawned on me as we're going through these numbers and all these different names of contractors. So I have some basic questions for you. How are the services to be provided by selected contractors responsive to the needs assessments conducted in each of the grid zones?
Well, I think that was part of each application, was to respond to not only the 6 primary risk factors that were identified through the RFP process, but then to specifically look at what were the needs as well as the resources or assets that were identified in those assessments that were contingent in each particular area. So part of the review process looked at how agencies articulated what was in the needs assessment, what was identified as both needs and assets that were actually identified in that, and then how they would utilize that. So that was definitely part of how they were scored and reviewed.
All right, and then also through this process, being this was the first time we've done it this way as a city, what norms and standards or what was learned from this process, and we have another set of grid zones that are coming up, another 6. What did your office learn? What kinds of things are you looking to improve upon for the next go around?
Well, one thing, I think it was a good, we recruited 5 different kinds of representatives for each of the 6 areas that made up, came from different kind of, law enforcement, education, and gang experts, community reps.
You're talking about people who reviewed?
That's right, who did the first proposal. Panel review. And then we tried to recruit a group of folks for each one of those 6 areas. And then we had this oversight committee. And then we had an interview process where we used 2 folks from each one of the 6 areas, as well as 1 person from the oversight city. One of the challenges was being able to recruit the folks, because we weren't paying people to do this, to ask them to do a lot of reviewing and a lot of work. And so we were very fortunate to have people who were willing to dedicate the amount of time that it took to do that. I think one of the challenges will be moving forward, especially in the fall when we have a parallel process going on for an additional 6 areas for prevention as well as 12 areas for intervention, is going to be able to recruit a appropriately diverse group of reviewers and have that selection process continue to include as broad a group as possible. So that's one of the challenges I see moving forward, and that we're already talking about how to do that.
Well, one of the things that I need to know the answer to this question, and I hope that I get one answer, because we're putting a lot of confidence and expectation in the mayor's office in this process. You just described 2 processes where they're going to be running somewhat concurrent of the second go-around of the second 6 grid zones for prevention, the RFP process and the applications and the reviews and all those things. And then you have somewhat concurrent to that, you have 12 intervention areas, grid zone areas that you're going to be talking about prevention. And then on top of that, we have the process for outside
That's right.
grid zones, right? For prevention and intervention.
That's right.
So are you comfortable that you're ready for that
Well, we're working, as you know,
when the
on
time comes? Because ready meaning getting ready, and also, in certain months, which months rolling forward are going to be the most intense when you add up all these 3 things.
Yeah, I think for our office, the most intense period will be, the time immediately following the actual submission of proposals for all these areas, and then conducting that review process. That's going to be where we're going to have a solid group of folks as part of that process, willing to dedicate a significant amount of time. So that is something we're looking at. I mean, right now we're focused primarily on the developing of the RFP for the intervention services, as well as looking at right now, as we are finishing this first process in terms of prevention, are there any things we could do to streamline, to make the RFP more clear, and kind of more technical, small fixes to that process, and then really outline the entire intervention RFP process.
Okay. Now, we're all expecting that the processes that were just described are all expected to come to and culminate in results clearly by December 31st, so that those contracts hopefully will start on time on January 1st. Do you feel comfortable or confident that you're still within that timeline?
That's going to be a very aggressive timeline. That is still our target. I think part of it will determine, one is we have 5 additional needs assessments that are presently being conducted. We're hoping to have those completed by the advancement project by the end of September. We can't really release the RFPs and for the new additional areas until those are completed, because they'll be an integral part of the RFP process. But assuming they stay on time, then we'll issue that RFP. We'll have a review period of time, and then obviously, going through the appeals and stuff like that. So it's aggressive, but that's still our target to try and accomplish that.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
in terms of questions, should we wait, or?
Well, we're going to be spending the next hour and a half on questions
Yeah.
from you and me, so.
No, I'll just bite my tongue and I'll wait for my turn.
All right. I have a few more, but
Okay.
we'll all get a chance.
Thank you.
Now, you just mentioned, well, let me go back on a point. These 6 that we're reviewing today on this item, these 6 prevention providers for these 6 grid zones, you just mentioned that the advancement project is going to do the next 6?
No, we are not doing one in the Boyle Heights Hollenbeck area, where the gang reduction program, GRP, has been in place for the last 2.5
5.
years. Yeah, so there's additional 5 there, which includes Rampart, Southwest 2, 77th 2, Watts Southeast, and Panorama City. So it's those 5.
So the evaluations are going to be done by advancement project.
The needs assessments and resource
the
mapping.
needs assessments by the end of September.
That's their target date to do that.
But these 6 were all done by different organizations.
That's correct.
So that's a lot of work for one agency. You've confirmed with them that they're ready to do that?
They're actually
amount of work
already
in this
working on
amount of
all of
time?
them. So, yeah, they're actually into all of them. The Rampart, we've gotten the first draft of the Rampart one already. The other 4 are in process.
Okay. And you don't see any concern or any reason? Now,
No, they're
that's
actually
one
sub-
organization doing 5.
They're actually subcontracting some of the work out to Cal State Los
Okay.
Angeles, who was one of the other additional contractors. So they're not doing it completely on their own. They're doing, if you recall, in the first rounds of assessments, Healthy Cities is still doing all the maps the way it was done before, but they have subcontracted out some of the work.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I just want to interject one thing. You got a moment of time here. I want to just ask a question.
Sure.
In this, because I don't want to ruin your momentum either. So
Go ahead.
That's okay. You know, first, Reverend Carr, I want to thank you for. I know you drove by Cypress Park the other day on night out, so I appreciate your presence there. Folks told me we saw Jeff Carr drive by, and he was to come by, so I thank you for that thought.
Sure.
But I wanted to. I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but I'm looking at this environment as we go through these processes, and for some of us in the council, we've spent a lot of time in our neighborhoods and in our district, and so when I hear about these deadlines and maybe we'll get an environment, maybe we'll get, hopefully be ready, it's intensive, it's aggressive. Do you see yourself or your team working with council staff and trying to understand how we can make this as effective as possible, as opposed to, because the sense I'm getting, and I don't mean to be antagonistic, it's just I want to understand our posture. Are we working as a team? I mean, your operation and the council offices, just because of the way the information has been coming and going, it doesn't feel that way right now. And I want to know if we could, how can we assist you in making those goals as you go through this process? Because there was this question about the application, and when can we see the application? And my staff has told me we don't get to see it until council, and I'm trying to understand that. And so I want to make sure that you understand that I'm trying to see this as a friendly, as a cooperative effort.
Sure.
But it seems like there's this entrenchment of sorts, and I'm not sure if that's real or not, if that's perceived, but just the way this process is unfolding, it just doesn't, I'm not getting the warmest feelings, and I want to make sure we understand, because the questions the council member is asking are critical, and it just, your response is like, I think we're going to be ready, but you're not alone in this. I mean, this is about our neighborhoods and our kids. So I want to understand, how does the council, just from your point of view, given the questions the councilman has asked, how do we factor in this as a council?
Well, I feel like we are working with the council, and we certainly want to work with the council, the various council offices, particularly the ones that are more that are relevant in terms of where the gang reduction youth development zones are. I think as it relates to communication related to when this process was unfolding, our office was instructed by the city attorney to not divulge what was going on in terms of the process, to outline the process as it was that we were undergoing, but to not talk about the specifics of particular agencies' proposals until the process had been entirely completed, including the appeals process. And we were advised to not do that with council offices or with other groups within the public. So that's the advice that we were given by the city attorney's office, and that's why we made that decision.
But you know, we have had to hire our own attorneys within the council through the CLA because we were questioning some of their opinions. I don't think they should be the last word. I think we should be given an opportunity to ask, why is the city attorney saying that? But to put us in a place where it's almost we become irrelevant is not healthy. It's not healthy. Because in the council meeting, if we finally get to see it at that moment, we have to make decisions in almost like we're shooting from the hip. And that's not healthy for the programs, for the youth, for our city. I mean, we should be in a position, because the city attorney is supposed to be working for the council. If you look at the charter, the city attorney, we're his clients. And then for that posture to be taken is very alienating. It's not healthy. And so I don't understand why we would put so much stock in his opinion when it's one attorney's opinion, one office's opinion. We could have gotten other attorney's opinion. So I'll stop there, but I'm getting to...
I'm gonna help hopefully clarify some of that answer, because you're talking to the mayor's office, who's interpreting the city attorney's recommendations to them. And is Richard Bob here from the city attorney's office? I think he's one of the ones, if not the one, that answered this question or advised the mayor's office. So on that note, can you outline for us maybe some examples of the kinds of activities that you would recommend to the mayor's office that they not engage in for the purposes of keeping the RFP process fair and not the kinds of activities that could happen between the mayor's office and such as a council member or council member's office that would still keep the integrity of the RFP process and not infringe upon it, and then perhaps an example of something that you would recommend that the mayor's office not do because it might jeopardize the integrity of the process.
Certainly. Mr. Chairman, my name is Richard Bob, members of the committee. I'm a deputy city attorney, and I've been advising the mayor's office of gang reduction and youth development for some time. The way that our RFP process generally works within the city, especially when you've got grant funds involved, which this does, and adds a whole nother layer on the requirements of the RFP process, is that a department is certainly free to talk to council members, to outside community members, to anyone that it wants to in developing the RFP, developing what the criteria is, developing what they'll be looking for, the needs assessment, all that stuff, and the mayor's office has done a terrific job, I think, in doing all that. Once it comes time for the evaluation, it really has to be a secretive process. It has to be among the people that the mayor's office gathers together, the outside community members, the knowledgeable people within government and education, to evaluate the proposals. Once you start interjecting politics and having other interference in there, your process is tainted. Traditionally, we have always said that once the department, and no matter what department it is, this has been our advice consistently throughout all departments, throughout all RFPs, not just the gang program. But it's been once the department makes a recommendation to the council, then everything is public record. Then you can take a look at everything. You can accept recommendations of the department, you can reject the recommendations of the department.
Okay, I understand what you just said, but what sticks out in my mind is, are you saying that city council members are not knowledgeable and we're just political?
I'm not saying that at all.
But that's what I've just heard you say.
No, what I was
Well, that's
saying...
why I wanted you to give a couple of examples, because just because an elected office inquires about something doesn't mean that it's a political inquiry or that that's going to taint the process. I would presume it would be certain kinds of involvement.
I suppose it depends upon what the question is and what the answer would be. But there is no real way to set up a list of acceptable and non-acceptable questions.
Let me give you an example, since I'm asking the questions.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. The RFP process was put on the streets on April 15th. There was a deadline for them to be turned in, which was sometime in May, I presume, May 15th, right?
Yeah.
So on May 16th, if Councilmember Reyes calls Jeff Carr and says, Jeff, can you give me the list of the organizations that submitted a proposal? Is that the kind of thing where Jeff could actually give him a list of the names of organizations? Now, that question does not involve evaluation. It doesn't involve what do you think about them or what have you, just black and white. Who applied?
That's the limit of the question, I would say it could be answered, but implicit in that question is some amount of pressure to want to have some influence on the outcome of the procedure. It would be far better not to have any communication until the process is done.
Now, wait a minute. There's one thing about legal and you telling me far better. It's two different things. It's two different things. It's not a good idea for a kid to be walking around Pacoima at 1 o'clock in the morning wearing baggy pants, hanging around on Van Nuys Boulevard. Not a good idea. Okay, let's say it's an adult, because we do have curfews in this city. It's an adult. Not a good idea. Not against the law. Now, the answer to my question, I understand what you're saying. What you're trying to say is, let's stay away from perceived potential problems, right? That's part of what your answer was, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, council member could ask for a list of the names, but I wouldn't recommend it. But the fact of the matter is, you have an elected official who answers to the public. Regardless of why he or she is asking that question, they have the right to ask that question. Now, in that scenario, what would you recommend legally that the mayor's office do if the mayor's office were to get that request? That's that explicit request. Can you give me the names of the organizations that applied? The deadline's over for applying. Not give me the scores, not tell me what you think about them, not tell me if you thought it was a sloppy one or not. Just, can you give me the names? With all due respect, I'm going to take it one step further. If somebody were to add that color to the question, by the way, tell me if this application looks sloppy or what have you, I can answer that question for the mayor's office right away. And that is, I'll give you the list of names, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer the second question. I can't. Because we're the evaluators, right, Jeff?
Yes.
The mayor's office is the evaluators.
Let me tell you why I'm uncomfortable with giving a list of the names.
Okay.
And a specific example that came from this RFP process. There were several proposals that were not turned in on time.
Mm-hmm.
So that if the due date was the 26th,
It was the 15th.
the 15th, if the due date was the 15th, I believe there were one or two proposals that were either misdelivered.
By my notes right here, it says 2 proposals were received after the submission deadline of May
Right.
15th. So,
And those, whether or not those proposals were actually, should be reviewed or not,
in this case, they were not evaluated. By
they were not evaluated, but there were appeals. And the appeals weren't final until the appeals were heard. So therefore, it gets problematic to say who's turned them in now and who hasn't turned them in now, because we really don't know until the expiration of the appeals.
No.
Because if the appeals board determines that they were submitted in good faith and they should be evaluated, then they made the deadline. If the appeals board determines
Yeah, but that
they
inquiry
weren't,
doesn't interfere with that. Or you're telling me it does? That specific inquiry interferes with what you just described?
well, if the councilman wants to know how many people applied, and we tell him 10, or the mayor's office tells
No,
him 10,
my specific question is, give me the list of the organizations that applied. I'm talking about names. Name number
All right,
1.
They give
name
you
number
10
2.
names. They give you 10 names.
Okay.
And later it's determined that 2 proposals were turned in late, but they were turned in good faith, and there really should have been 12 names on that list. Then the council member's going to be upset.
So what? That's not, the council member being upset in this scenario is not, there's no illegality, there's no infringement on the process, because the councilman got upset, because later on he says, wait a minute, you gave me a list of 10 names and this organization didn't get evaluated. Well, if I were Jeff, I would say, well, with all due respect, councilman, they turned it in late. Well, why didn't you tell me? Well, because we were still trying to determine if they were going to get evaluated. I'm really sorry about that, but that's the thing. We stamped it. If you want me to show you the stamp, come to our office and look at the stamp. This is after the fact, right? But with all due respect, Councilman, you asked me for the 10 names and I gave them to you.
Mr. Chair, my point is this. I'm the last one who wants to in any way blemish the integrity of the process. That's the last thing I want.
No, I'm the last.
Well, we all are.
We're equal.
There you go. But the bottom line is, there's a wealth of knowledge out there that if we start being political, by, I think, these alienating gestures, then it's going to go into a direction we don't want it to. But if at least we had a level of understanding of this is where we're going and the facts for what they are, if we understood those facts and not just been told we can't do this because the city attorney said, then we're cultivating an environment that's not healthy. Because now we're reading into different things that we don't need to read into. And that's what I don't want to see. So I'm just sharing with you my perspective of this teamwork that we should be having. And you're right. I mean, I wasn't here when the city operated 20 years ago, 25 years ago. We have a city ethics commission now. We have a lot of checks and balances that never existed before. But from my point of view, this is a very critical moment in time for the city. And for it to start off with these kinds of responses, it just doesn't feel right to me. That's all I wanted to say. But I'm not here to advocate or push for any one entity. I'm just wondering, where do we start valuing the experience of the council office in this process? I mean, granted, the responsibility has been placed on the mayor's office, and it's a very courageous place to be in terms of what we need to do for our youth. But we still have the reality of the results are going to be impacting our council districts. And I know the charge is taking care of the whole city. But there are some of us who still live in the places we grew up in and happen to be council members. And there's a lot of knowledge out there that we should be working with. And I don't see it happening within this process because of the legalities that you've expressed. And I think that's a weakness right now. I'm hoping that'll change as we go through this.
Well, as I said before, the council offices are certainly free to help on the formulation of the RFP. When it comes to the evaluation of the RFP, it should be a private process. Once that information ceases to be private because it is released to anyone, it is then public record, available to everyone, and that can be problematic. Now, if the council wanted to, it could have created a new gang office, not in the mayor's office, with direct input from the council office, but that's not what's happened so far. Right now, what's happened is it's in the mayor's office. The mayor's office is charged with creating the program and evaluating the RFPs, presenting the results to the council for the council's approval.
I appreciate that. And I guess the question to that is, how do you define private? Who's part of that private stage of decision-making? And that's where I think we need to understand what is healthy for the city.
I think we have in this process, we have three phases. We have the process of determining what the actual RFP process is going to be. Now, during that phase, Mr. City Attorney, council offices or third parties or what have you can give their opinions about what they think it should be or what should be interjected or what have you. But once that process is solidified and then it starts to take place with the mayor, in this case the mayor's office, then that's the part where the mayor's office takes control and controls information, controls the process, et cetera, and then has to determine what kind of information, regardless of whatever inquiries come their way, what they should or should not release or give to who or what. And then there's the third part, where we're at right now, which is that segment of the process is over. Now we're looking in retrospect and asking questions, what happened, how did this go, or how many people applied, or what have you, and who, what, where, when. And then during this process, as policymakers, as legislators, we can actually effectuate change. We can actually write an ordinance that says, in the next time you guys do this, we want it to go this way, or what have you. I'm not saying that we're doing that today, or we're gonna, or not gonna, or what have you. But I'm saying legally, that's what the legislative body can do, right?
Correct. And the legislative body can not approve of the recommendations if you so choose.
Exactly. Now, but the thing is, what I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to interpret some of what you're getting at, Councilmember Reyes, is that there are certain things that the council offices can legally be privy to and not interfere with the integrity of the process. Like the example I gave, I think that once the deadline is over, if a council office wants to know the names of the organizations that submitted, and there's probably should be an asterisk next to the names that came late or what have you, because those are just the facts. Because the mayor's office in no way would want to skew those facts, because somebody made the deadline or not. Somebody missed the deadline or not. Maybe they have an internal process to say, what was the reason for the deadline, them missing the deadline? Was it because somebody left the desk where they turned them in at 4:55 instead of 5 o'clock? And they attest to that and say, we were there at 4:59 and nobody was there to receive it, so we got there at 8 o'clock in the morning the next day and gave it to you or what have you. I would think that the mayor's office would have the opportunity to decide if that is deemed late or not. You follow what I'm saying? Those kinds of things. But once those facts take place, it just is what it is. So the list of who submitted, unless you correct me if I'm wrong, that doesn't infringe on the integrity of the process.
Well, let me just be very specific. The question of the application, I was just taken aback by that, because if this is the application that's going to be recommended, and we have to make a decision in the council, it would behoove the council to have time to review the application, since it's already been selected by the group. That's what's coming down the pipeline.
But what you're saying is now.
Now, because, put it this way, I get a report from a department, and it's a policy issue we have to make a decision on, and it impacts a critical phase of the city. We're given the report that morning, and we have to make a decision that afternoon. How much time do we get to understand the impacts of those recommendations? And see, and to me, that was, if that's what happened, I mean, that's what I'm questioning. Why can't we have the ability to understand who's being recommended with time so that we learn?
Well, I hear Councilmember Reyes asking a different question than before. Does the council now, on this day, have access to the proposals?
Yes.
So that you answered that question quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, the council, since what we're looking at here and the way our process works and by our city charter and the authority of the mayor's office and the council and all that interplay, the bottom line is these 6 recommendations legally don't have to be approved by the council as such, these 6.
That's correct.
So therefore, because we do have that authority, then we do have access, or technically we should have access. The mayor has the proposal, the mayor's office has the proposals. So what you're saying to the mayor's office and to us, if a council office wants a copy of each one of those proposals and to see the intricacy of the process that was a closed-door process, now the council offices have the authority and the right to see and review that process.
That's correct. If I may, the way that the charter and the administrative code work together, the process is supposed to be as follows. A department runs the RFP, department runs...
This is not a department.
Well, a department...
I hope you clarify that for us.
The mayor's office is a department.
What?
Isn't it? Isn't the mayor's office a department?
The mayor's office is an elected office.
Okay.
They're treated differently than a department. Like, for example, you're going to hear me talk to Mr. Jeff Carr as a representative of the mayor's office, and I'm going to request things from the mayor.
What?
I'm not going to tell Mr. Jeff Carr what to do. But when it comes to a department, as a member of the council, the elected body, we tell departments what to do.
That distinction is absolutely true for the purposes you just mentioned, but for the purposes of running an RFP or running a program, a department or an office
I'm listening.
Are pretty much the same thing. The office or the department runs the RFP, comes to an independent decision, has the appeals, and then it's up to the administrative body to determine whether that process was fair or not. Okay? It's not a trial de novo, as we say in
Who's the
legal.
administrative body, as you just mentioned?
That would be the city council.
So we're acting as an administrative body? I always thought we were always exclusively the legislative body.
Well, I'm not sure I know the difference it makes in this particular
Because
instance.
people reference governors and presidents and mayors, as such as the structure we have in the city, as the administration. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
And then they refer to the council and legislatures and Congress, for example, in our structures, as the legislative body.
Well, then let me not use labels.
Okay.
Let me simply say the
Because
city.
you're confusing me. Because
I don't want to do that.
And the thing is, Jeff and I have had these conversations publicly and privately about with all due respect, the responsibilities and the customs and practice, and then the inherent responsibilities by the charter when it comes to the elected office of the mayor and the body of the council, et cetera. So the thing is, I'm listening very closely, Bob, with what you're saying. Richard, is what you're saying, because this isn't new territory, but this is a pretty intense process, and we're doing it very differently than we've done for the last 20-some years on this particular policy matter.
Correct.
So I'm listening very carefully to what you're saying.
The point is that the council has the option of approving or disapproving the process, really, the process and the outcome. If the council doesn't like it, the council can send it back. But the council cannot order, for example, that the mayor's office must contract with provider XYZ. They can
That's
say,
what I
they
thought.
can say, we don't like your process, we want you to go back and do it again.
I'm not saying that.
No, but what he's saying.
I understand.
we
I
have
just,
that
but just
authority.
for the record,
If the council had the opinion, if the council had the power to say you must deal with X, Y, and Z, then the council would be in on the decision-making process, and this would be in essentially a review de novo, a brand-new review of the whole, of the merits of the situation. This is a review of the process, and if you're unhappy with the process, you can tell them to go back and do it again. If you want copies of anything, you can do that. You can continue this. You can do whatever. You can do all those things. But to respect the integrity of the decision-making process, the department, the office, whatever have you, has to have autonomy to be able to do that free from outside interference.
Mm-hmm. Now that autonomy, I know, Jeff, you got a lot to say, but hold on a second. I don't want to lose this thought. Now, the autonomy, so far up to this moment, is still, as far as I can tell, is still following suit. But at the same time, one of the ways in which we can learn from the process and as a legislative body interject in the process rolling forward is to make recommendations and or get as formal as writing a motion and interjecting some of the elements that should be involved in subsequent processes, right? That's one of the ways in which we could interplay in this particular, the process that we've actually started and that is on the agenda
With
today.
respect to these,
Not with respect to these, I'm talking rolling
Future,
forward.
absolutely.
Because as we mentioned earlier, there's going to be another 6 RFPs that granted to 6 other prevention contracts in 6 additional zones. There's going to be 12 other contracts potentially being granted on intervention for all 12 zones, and then the contracts for services rendered outside of the zones, et cetera. So when it comes to that, this body has the authority and the ability to interject in that, as I just described, for those rolling forward processes, right?
yes.
yeah. Again, I don't see myself, and I don't believe the council wants to in any way influence how you're making that decision, because you have your process, and I want to maintain that integrity. What I'm saying is, when we have within the process the legal right to know on what basis we're making decisions on, we should have that information so we can make that decision. And I just feel that in this one instance, we were told that we could not see the application. I did not understand that. And then we were told that's because the city attorney's directive, and made me even more confused. Because I am not trying to influence what the decision was being. I needed to understand the substance of that application so I can make an informed decision the day we're supposed to vote on that. And I just want to clarify that. And so it's not about impeding on the privacy and the integrity of the process, or it's not me trying to be political and trying to interject and influence and taint the integrity of the process. That is not my intention, and that is not my desire. My focus is, how do I make an informed decision, and are we giving enough time to understand what the application consists of so that we can have a dialogue at the appropriate time on the council floor to take the right actions.
It is my understanding that it has consistently been the position of my office that when the transmittal is transmitted to the city clerk saying who the department or the office recommends, that at that point, all the applications, all the scoring sheets are all public record. That's consistently been the position of my office.
In RFP processes within the city,
Correct.
not just this kind.
Correct.
So that's why I just want to say, with Mr. Carr, we have this moment in time where this is the kind of discussion we could be having publicly or within our office, but to understand the application.
Sure.
To understand what that's going to do to our district.
Well, I hope you I hope you know our intent was not to alienate the council office. So there's no question about that. I think we tried to run the process the best we could, given the advice we were given, to make the decisions in an appropriate way to guarantee a transparent process. It was one of the reasons the day that we submitted the transmittal to the city clerk, we also sent hard copies and took copies to all the council offices at the same time that morning that we submitted the transmittal, because we wanted the council offices to have that information as soon as we were instructed it could be public. And so our intent was not to be adversarial with the council in any way, shape, or form. We were trying to do what we thought was right. And we'd be happy to sit down with your office and with the city attorney's office, and if there are ways, because we are doing this again, and very soon, and if there are ways we can improve that communication process without jeopardizing the integrity, we'd love to do that. We're happy to do that.
And then perhaps we need to have a clear understanding of how the city attorney, Mr. Bob, is interpreting, and you're interpreting this notion of private. Like, there's a discretionary point that you have defined within the process. And so what is that private box that we should be respecting because you don't want political influence?
Sure.
And I appreciate that concept.
I believe the private box has been developed along the lines of what is a public record. And it has been interpreted by several attorneys in my office that a public record is when the final report is final. Then everything is public. Before then, it's not public. So once the final report, after all the appeals have been exhausted, after the department makes its final recommendation, after it writes its final report and submits it to the clerk, then everything is public. The trouble is, before then, if it is waived to one party, it's waived to the world.
Sure. Okay. But at the same time, let's go back to the scenario I just gave. What if somebody wants to know, deadline is over for submission, what are the names of the parties that submitted? But what's your interpretation of responding to that request and giving those names? Did that legally cause a problem in the process, such as this one?
My first inclination would be go ahead and give the list. However, I would like to check it out with some senior people in my office.
And the reason why I say give the list, because that request, the way I see it, is black and white. And even if that person were to go ahead and try to color that question with some other questions, what do you think about this organization or what have you, that's where the person reverts down to, well, you just asked me, you gave me 10 requests. And the only one that I can abide by legally and fiduciary, keeping my fiduciary responsibilities and all that color, I say I can give you the names of the list. Whether they say we have to double check it, we'll get it to you tomorrow or what have you, but the bottom line is we can give you that black and white list, but no color commentary is going to come along with it or what have you.
As I said, my first instinct is to completely agree. But I'd like to run it by some smart people.
Well, in general, when it comes to RFP processes within the city, when we have a closing deadline, aren't on some of them, they actually, within a day or 2 weeks or what have you, people expect that who met the deadline, that it's going to be divulged to the public, even though the rest of the process.
I'm not aware of that, but it may very well be.
But do you understand what I'm getting at? Because when you have an April 15th, opening date, you have like a May 15th closing deadline. You have to meet this deadline, or else you're not going to be considered, whatever the legal language is. Once that deadline passes, giving the names of who applied doesn't divulge scoring. It doesn't get into the intricacies of the process. It's just a black and white answer. Who met the deadline? So in the future, to the mayor's office, in the future, between now and the next process, maybe you should clarify with the mayor, with the city attorney's office, as to what kind of things are considered black and white. You know what I'm saying? In case you get those requests.
Sure.
Or maybe even offer to say, look, once the deadline's over, we're going to give ourselves 5 business days to compile the list, and we're going to let everybody know who applied, right? So that it's not perceived as we gave it to a particular council member, therefore people can read between the lines and say, well, they're asked because of this organization or that. You follow what I'm saying? Maybe that can be part of the process.
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Because that's black and white.
So I'd like to know more about the Children's Hospital application before Friday, before next week. If it's already been selected, it's public, it's known, why not look at the application? But we were told we couldn't.
Yeah, I had a different understanding of what we could do in terms of the application. Now it's clear to me that we can actually give you copies of that. We're happy to do that.
Appreciate that, Mr.
I thought we were not allowed to do that as well, so we're perfectly happy. Now if that's part of the public record, we're happy to give you that.
I appreciate that very
Yeah.
much. Thanks.
By the way, I know that I don't know when, but I know that when it comes to the more typical public works projects, like building the building across the street or what have you, actually during the appeals process, or in some fashion, part of the appeals, and I'm not recommending it here. I think that you need to talk to the city attorney's office and review, the do's and don'ts. But for example, when it comes to bricks and mortar type contracts that are awarded, and even before the final approval, that some of the challengers of that award actually have the opportunity to ask more detailed questions as to whether or not Cypress construction applied or not. They actually get more access than that, so that they can not only challenge it by what we've offered as Company A, but challenge it by saying, look, Company B didn't comply with their MeeBee-Weebie. Company B didn't, provide these things. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
So I think that the mayor's office may want to get those clarifications.
Sure. We're happy to do that.
I don't know what questions were asked of you. That's your business. I know what questions I asked of the mayor's office or didn't ask or what have you. As far as I'm concerned, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, again, we're going to see this kind of process several times in the next 6 months. So try to get more of that clarified.
That would be great.
Such as the Children's Hospital request. Now that everybody knows, Mr. Reyes' office is going to get that, right? Right away, I presume?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. I do have some other questions. You actually asked question number 5, so
Sorry, man.
I'm still on the second half of question.
That's rough your timing there.
No. You got to one of the questions I had on the list. Now, earlier I asked you a question about the intervention and prevention RFP process / RFQ, whatever is determined, and then the awarding and placement of those contracts, hopefully going to start on January 1st of 2009. If there's a gap, say it's 15 days, 30 days, or what have you, what kind of mechanism do we anticipate we will have in order to make sure that there's not a gap in service? Do we have the authority to go ahead and extend which will be existing through December 31st, the Bridges 1 and 2 contractors that are still rendering service out there in the community through the end of this year.
I believe if we were to do that, we'd have to come back to council. That's my assumption based on what I know about the process.
But the mechanism exists for a month-to-month.
I think, well, we'd have to ask on that, but I believe there.
Anybody here from CDD, Bridges, and all that stuff? Because maybe they've had to extend it month-to-month.
We can certainly.
Because
check
those
with
contracts are still the same contracts that were written by CDD. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yes.
Right. So I guess that question is a CDD. They're not here. That obviously that's not I hope that question never has to be.
Yeah.
The answer to that question never has to be exercised. But that's one of the things that we're going to need CDD and maybe through the mayor's office as well. You can double check with that because all of that is.
But we can certainly find out what's allowable.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm confident we would have to come back to council to take that action. I'm looking over here and seeing that I think the answer to that question is yes.
Meg Barkley with the CLA, I would imagine if additional extended contract authority and probably additional funding to go with those services were required, that would require council approval.
Okay. But the question was not whether or not it would require council approval. The question was more those mechanisms do exist.
Yes.
For month-to-month extensions.
Yes.
Because I think that's commonplace
Yeah.
here in the city. We do that all the time.
Yes.
I believe it's true. I don't want to say definitively till I check it, but I believe it's probably possible, and it would require council action.
Okay. Now, what's the status of the RFP process for the citywide prevention services? In other words, outside the zones?
Well, as you know, we are working on both the gang intervention.
Let me qualify. I think it's inherent in. I don't want people to assume that no activity is going on outside the zones. I presume that we're all assuming that the Bridges 1 and 2 contracts, when it comes to prevention and intervention, is in fact in place today through December 31st outside the zones.
Yeah, yeah.
Within and outside the zones.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
correct. Yeah. So
But
we
the
are
process.
we are working on an RFP for the intervention services, as you know, for both inside the grid zones as well as outside, and then we
And
will
prevention
be
as well.
And then we will be modifying a little bit the prevention RFP that we just have now for outside the grid zones, because obviously there won't be a needs assessment attached with that, similar to what we have in the grid zones. So we're looking at how to modify that to ask providers to probably give us a little bit more, to make more of a case for the need. In some ways, the needs assessment makes the case for the need inside the grid zones, but we'll need to have contractors or providers or potential providers make that case more. So we're looking at how we modify that.
And the
That-
timeline for the
Same timeline.
But the timeline for the timeline for the implementation outside the zones when it comes to prevention and intervention is January 1st.
That's our, yeah, we're
Because
trying
that
to make a
concurs with
parallel
the
process.
fact that we are continuing the Bridges 1 and Bridges 2 through January 1st.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so therefore, when it comes to the prevention and intervention services outside the zones now and through December 31st, that's under their purview day-to-day via the mayor's office or CDD?
No, the contracts were, the initial contracts were negotiated and developed with the Community Development Department. Those were passed on because it was our office that was actually given the authority to actually execute the contracts for the final 6 months for Bridges. And then we actually executed those, and then they're now under our supervision for the final 6 months in terms of oversight.
Okay, and you have the appropriate staff and all that?
Yeah.
That is on top of that?
We've been monitoring that those contracts are all executed. We've made payments to all the contractors that have submitted cash requests. I think we did that in some cases in record time. And we're in the process of calling a meeting with all the contractors to talk about the final closeout and to give them instructions and talk about reporting and all that here in the next few weeks.
Okay. All right. On to another matter. How were the community panels selected? and then also the appeals panels selected?
Well, the community panelists were, the review panelists consisted of 5 different kinds of people, from education, law enforcement, prosecutorial agencies, gang experts, and researchers, and then relevant city and county social service departments, and then community residents. So our program managers identified folks in those targeted areas. And then we, each of those reviewers received training on the review process. They were required to sign a conflict of interest non-disclosure statement form, indicating they had no, direct or indirect financial interest in reviewing the applications. And then we had a 4-person oversight committee that had representatives from gang and research experts, education, community development, and actually public health. And again, they were trained on the review process. And then when we had the actual interviews, we had an additional 8 questions, and there was a member of the oversight committee, the 4-person oversight committee, and then 2 members from that local review committee that then conducted the interviews with each of 2 agencies in 5 of the areas, and there was actually a tie in one of the grid zones, and so we actually had an interview process with 3 agencies in that process.
Now, the conflict of interest focus of whether or not somebody did or did not have a conflict of interest had to think about it and either disclose it or say, no, I have no conflict of interest.
Yeah,
had to do
that.
with the
Could have been
issue of
somebody who
compensation.
was, could have been someone who was on a board.
Yeah,
Obviously,
because
one of the
boards,
agencies.
a lot of these not-for-profit, people who are on these not-for-profit boards are
Right.
not compensated, but they're obviously, they're board, they're decision makers
Right.
on behalf of organizations.
That obviously would have been a conflict of interest to,
How about advisory boards?
I'm not sure.
Because advisory boards don't tend to have voting authority within boards, but obviously they're connected enough to be listed as advisory.
Yeah, I'd have to check on that. I don't believe there was anyone who was connected to an advisory board that would have that kind of conflict of interest, but we can certainly look into that. And
But
see.
just know, I don't believe that if somebody's advisory, that means that they automatically have a conflict of interest. For example, a lot of us elected officials are considered advisory to organizations because they ask us to be advisory. Granted, if somebody were to call me and ask me a question from a not-for-profit that I believe in, I'd be more than happy to give them my 2 cents. But a lot of times, and I'm clarifying something, a lot of times I never give them any formal advice or what have you, yet they list me as advisory, or many of us elected, the mayor and us and supervisors and congressional members or what have you. But there are people who advisory who do get tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, can you come to our meeting every now and again? You're a psychologist or you're a this or that, and we really would appreciate you sitting down and giving us some of that formal advice.
Well, we went out of our way to try and ensure that there was not even the appearance of a conflict of interest, because we wanted this to be a fair and equitable process that no one would question. So,
Okay. All right. These organizations, as was mentioned by the city attorney, if approved by the council, et cetera, are going to be performing a lot of important work out in the community. And what's the status of we've talked about this publicly and privately. What's the status of the comprehensive performance measures? Have they been developed yet? Are they being formulated?
well, we did outline in the RFP process in terms of the
Expectations.
the expectations and the outcomes we hope to achieve with the prevention, and that's obviously the primary ones are to keep kids, prevent young people from joining gangs. We are in the process of finalizing the assessment tool, the gang risk assessment tool, which will be used to actually enroll young people into the program. One of the measurements, obviously, will be to reassess young people's risk factors at 6 and 12-month cycles. But so some of those are already listed in that. We're in the process of also now developing an RFP for the evaluators, who will be evaluating not just the prevention but the entire gang reduction youth development program. And that outside entity will actually be the ones, once we get them on board, who will be helping us really be clear about what exact data they need to collect to be able to make those adequate assessments, not just for these prevention dollars, but also for the intervention dollars as well.
Now, you mentioned that outside entity, but technically it could be, like, for example, there were various organizations that put together the, gosh, I'm at a loss for the word, The needs assessments, thank you. Various organizations put them together, and you mentioned that the subsequent 6 are going to be done mainly by AP, but they're contracting components of that to other organizations. Do you see any need to want to have the evaluators rolling forward when they're picked? Is there inherently something that I'm concerned if it's one organization evaluating all 12 plus outside the zones and all that stuff? I would think that especially since we're in a transition process and we're doing something very different than we've ever done before in the city, that it might behoove us to hopefully get a talented pool of organizations that could actually do different areas, different evaluations, because I think inherent in that, there might be things that we've learned based on their different styles and the different things that they bring to the table in order for us to put together a longer term best practices evaluation system.
Well, we're actually developing the RFP for the evaluation right now, so we'd be welcome to get any suggestions that council or other folks who have experience in that area would want to make. We're actually soliciting that input.
But you get those two points of my question. One was that you just answered, but the other one was, should we be looking at hopefully having enough talent to where we don't have to give the evaluations all to one organization?
Well, I think it depends on obviously, it depends on who responds to the RFP. I mean, it could, and I don't know how.
It'd be sad if we only had one. It's just like anything. You want to build a building across the street, and we only get one good qualified contractor. Right. We're kind of like, yikes, that's not good competition.
But what I meant is I don't know if, I mean, you could have, for say, multiple institutions who might actually come together to collaborate, similar to agencies who are providing services. Many of them collaborated in a proposal, and so I don't know that we might not have multiple evaluating agencies that would come together and say, you know what, we think evaluating 12 different areas is too much for our particular evaluation agency or institution to do by ourselves, but we've partnered with this group, or this group has additional expertise that we don't possess. So I could see it coming in possibly in collaborations of evaluators might come together. You might have an independent team that feels like they have the expertise until we issue an RFP and get actually solicit responses and receive the responses. It's sort of premature for us to know, would it make most sense to have one group that oversees all 12 or to divide it up in some ways into smaller subsets and have them. I mean, one thing I am concerned about, no matter whether we have one group that's doing it or if we had, say, 2 or 3 groups who are doing different zones, is to ensure that we have a consistency across and a uniformity of what our expectations and what our results are, so that we can ensure that we understand what's happening in the different areas, and we're clear that it's not just this group's judgment that this is working over here, but this group that's a different group on another area is making a different judgment based on their expertise, and we don't really know if it was unique to what was happening over here that was working, or if it was just a difference in the evaluator's assessment of what was going on. So however we do it, I want to just make sure that we have some level of uniformity. Obviously there's uniqueness that's going on.
Uniformity is definitely something that, out of fairness to the organizations providing the street level services,
right?
Uniformity on the evaluations is
But we would be open to some input actually on that, on the evaluation RFP. That'd be great.
And one of the reasons why I bring that up is because, and this is not I'm not saying that CDD was a problem in this, but I think just it's human nature. If you have somebody who sets up a program, and then you have somebody who administers a program, or in other words, all of a sudden they become vested in wanting to see it be successful. The last thing I would want to see is evaluators have some kind of connection. And again, even though they can do the best darn job they can to remain detached about what their involvement or what their input or what their opinion was about how good this organization is or what they expected to do a great job, it's just that human nature for people to want to see it be successful, kind of like their baby or what have you. And that was, to me, one of the issues that I think developed, unfortunately, as my opinion, with CDD over 20-some years. They were the ones who granted the contracts. They were the ones who administered, whether or not the people were doing their work. They were the ones to evaluate them. Then all of a sudden, you hear words like, well, that's my program. You're talking to somebody in management at CDD, and they blurt out, oh, that's my program. I know them very well. Or that's my program. I can tell you exactly what they're doing. Well, wait a minute. It's not your program. That program's being run by a third party. It's really their program.
Right.
And you're supposed to be overseeing them. And all of a sudden, this ownership comes along, and to me, all of a sudden, this protection of not wanting to, admit that, well, they really messed up. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I really see there's really sort of two different kinds of activities that need to take place. One is an oversight from our office in terms of contract compliance. We're going to execute contracts. We're going to agree through those contracts to a certain amount of services, certain amount of processes, financial integrity, those kinds of things. And so contract management is really our responsibility to ensure that that takes place. But then I think there needs to be, where the evaluation picks up is to really say, okay, did the intended outcomes that we hope to achieve through these programs that we're launching, are those actually having the impact that we hope to have? That has nothing to do with, did you fill out your financial, request forms correctly? Did you actually serve the numbers of kids that you said you were going to, serve? Those are really, for me, contract compliance. Evaluation is really looking at, did this have an impact that we hope to see? And that ought to be rightfully done by not only someone independent from the agencies, but someone independent from our office to ensure that, we're not cooking the books. So to speak.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as saying cooking the books, but the fact of the matter is glossing over or
absolutely.
Those kinds of things. Again, we're in a transition. I feel very good about where we're going as a city, and hopefully we even put more and more resources into this. But again, it's not just about resources. It's about being efficient. It's about being transparent. It's about all these things that we've promised the taxpayers, we promised our constituents, we promised agencies that everything's going to be transparent and everybody's going to be able to, say at the end of the day whether or not, whether I like it or not, hey, everything's being done appropriately.
We share that commitment and that goal.
Now, this is something I'd like you to I'm requesting the mayor's office provide us with this information as soon as you can put it together. And this is something for yourselves, but also something we need to know. Outside the grid zones, how you expect these services to develop as, for example, these prevention providers start to intensify work as they're being paid to do inside of zones, and then how the Bridges 1 and Bridges 2 contractors are going to continue to probably move more toward providing services outside the zones, I'm presuming, between now and December 31st. How you anticipate that relationship and those services being provided, how that's going to play out between now and December 31st.
Okay.
You get what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Because obviously there's going to be the transition, which is transitioning between now and January 1st, and also the services provided and the melding of agencies working together on a day-to-day basis between now and December 31st.
Mm-hmm. Sure, we'll do that.
All right. And that's for intervention and prevention. Okay. Do you have any more questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I did want to, and I want to start by saying thanks to the hard work of the mayor's office. About 4 years ago, we started pushing really hard to identify where the contracts of the city were going. And we learned that a large amount of monies were being contracted out to entities that weren't even part of the city, indeed not even part of the county. And so we put forth, after about 4 years of work with various departments in the mayor's office, a first source hiring ordinance that speaks to how we link contracts and jobs for our youth, given the contracts that come out of Department of Water and Power, airport, the harbor, all the way down the line. In the needs assessment, I believe there's an opportunity to link that policy and that resource base so that we have a direct line to these jobs within that process so that we can give the young folks a reason to not be part of that culture, or at least break away from that culture. Is that something we could fold into as you go through this phase of your development?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because we actually have already begun the work on that. One of the things that our office made a recommendation to the Workforce Investment Board was to actually set a goal this next year in the Workforce Development Plan of a 10% target for all of the clients who are receiving services through the work source centers and the one source centers to either be gang affiliated or ex-convicts. There's been, prior to this, there's been no requirement that those entities actually serve that population. It's not to say that they haven't been serving that population.
Or
but
no
there's been
formal compilation of data.
There's been no formal compilation. So what we're working, the WIB actually did set that as a target, a goal for this next year. And our office has, the mayor's office, including Deputy Mayor Larry Frank and I, who oversees workforce development issues, have had multiple meetings with the Community Development Department now that there is that target goal to say, okay, well, we're working on a referral process, first of all, to determine how do we make the referrals. That 10% target represents probably about 500 slots, roughly. So first of all is how do we develop a referral mechanism for agencies who are doing particularly intervention, or it could be prevention in the grid zones and outside, to actually get referrals into that system. What are the minimum requirements to ensure that they get accepted? And in fact, if they meet the minimum requirements, then the work source or one source center will have to say why they were denied if they met some minimal criteria, rather than, the preponderance for them to prove why will be on them as opposed to the referrers. And then a system to actually track them. Not only to track where they're at in the process, but then to actually develop a system to see where they get placed. And one of the things in talking with John Reamer from the Bureau of Contract Administration, thanks to the good work of particularly you, Councilman Reyes, and others on the council, to get these contracts with the source, first source hiring and things like that, one of his concerns has been we're going to create the demand, but we've got to ensure that we can create the supply of young people who are actually prepared to be able to interview and to be able to be successful in getting those jobs. It seems to me our assessment has been that one of the primary ways for us to ensure that is to leverage the existing $40 million plus in workforce development funds that the city already has, and to see if we can get that system to begin to serve the young people who actually have some sort of gang affiliation or have some particular record, and then to hold folks accountable for doing that.
So this, there'll be some type of link within this infrastructure that's evolving.
That's exactly our intent, yeah.
And the needs assessment process can I say this, can the link be defined within that phase, or is it going to be a different track?
Well, the needs assessment, actually, if you looked at many of, we did sort of a cursory summary of all 6 different areas. I mean, I remember one of the summaries that our staff did of all the 6 areas is, one of the things that was pointed out in all uniform across areas was they just put a bullet that said jobs, and more jobs was one of the key things. So one of the things we're trying to do, as I mentioned, is to figure out how you link up the services that are taking place inside the grid zones with jobs.
We're still trying to create the mechanism.
What I'm trying to do is create the mechanism within the existing city's workforce development system to ensure that the young people we're concerned about are actually getting into that system. Because as you can imagine, those group of young people obviously have more barriers to employment and therefore are harder to employ. One of the primary outcomes of the federal government in terms of our workforce dollars are success in actually placing a certain percentage. So we're sort of working on, we're balancing a requirement for certain levels of placement by the federal government that we don't have any control in terms of those outcomes, with wanting to say, well, we don't want to just cream off a whole segment of young people from our communities who are the hardest to employ and not put them in our system just because we fear that they may be hard to place and then we may get dinged on those outcomes. So we're trying to have a balance right now of goals and then set up the systems and the mechanisms for referrals and then for tracking. And then we're going to monitor and see how effective that is. And obviously, if we can move from 10% and increase that over time, that's exactly what we would hope to see happen.
Right. Well, you know, as a youngster, I was part of the NYC and the CYO, and I saw all the things that the dollars at that time were doing for the young folks. And then I've seen different versions of it as time has gone by. So I'm hoping that with a change of posture within the city family, with department heads and their discretion, that we can provide in this process a real sense of substance in terms of real dollars that the folks can angle for. But you're right, it's the mechanism and how we get the delivery and preparation so that they can actually absorb it and use it.
That's right.
We can talk more about that.
I'd
maybe.
love to work with you on that because that's a key component of whether or not we're going to be successful.
Thank you.
Yeah, also, Councilmember Reyes, I'm working on a motion to, my staff may have identified an internal mechanism that might, not with the mayor's office, with contract services, that we may have to clarify and then review for them in order for them to be able to keep up with that pace with this new goal that I hope that we do meet and reach. But when I pull that together, we'll run it by your office, the language, and then ask you to sign on.
Yes.
When we introduce it. The item, we anticipate this item is going to go to the council on next week, Friday. Okay, so just be ready for that. Be ready for questions. The various organizations may want to be there in case the council member asks them a question on the record. No problem with that, right? I mean,
No
council member can.
Everything is public record now.
Exactly. All right. So just make sure that they have certainly the most knowledgeable person they can provide, if not more than one person on that Friday, because I don't know how intense the questions are going to be or what have you, but it just might get intense, and somebody might want to ask them because, as Councilmember Reyes just pointed out, there's a lot of activity out there, and there's a lot of concern, and people want to make sure that these organizations know what they're doing, hit the ground running, and all that stuff. Okay.
And I believe many of them, if not most, are actually here as well today. So we'll encourage them to be here and be there on Friday.
Okay.
If I can just pose a question to Mr. Card, the final RFP for the new GRYD,
Anybody can ask a question.
could we include a direct link to the first source hiring ordinance? Is that something that we can make possible in order for us to elevate its stature and really push the departments to respond in a way in which we motivate them to use it?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly talk about, I'm not sure what the mechanism would be, but we'd be happy to talk with your office about how to do that. I mean, I think many, if not most of the, just experientially, typically nonprofits, most of them hire folks from the communities in which they're serving. That's not always the case, but we could certainly put in some sort of criteria based along the lines of that. We'd be happy to talk about that with your office.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I'm not saying this tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, you're going to need to run that language by the city attorney's office because there's all kinds of legal issues with directing third parties of who they hire and don't hire and stuff like
You're
that.
not messing with Mr. Bob, are you?
What's that?
You're not messing around with Mr. Bob, are you?
Nope. I wouldn't do that. We'll now go to public comment. We have Brenda Shockley and Virgie Walker. Those are the only two public comment cards I have on this item. So if anybody has please come forward. If anybody wants to make public comment to this committee on this item, please fill out a card and put down council file number 1. Also, I don't see any general public comment cards to this committee. It's kind of rare. So just let you know, I don't have any general public comment cards right now to this committee, in case you want to make general public comment as well. Yes, go ahead. State your name for the record.
Virgie Walker. I'm president of People Coordinated Services of Southern California. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. PCS has been providing comprehensive services to youth and families since 1939. I want to indicate that this was a very comprehensive process. It was a competitive process, and that's a process that has its strengths and its weaknesses. The weakness that some of the agencies that we deal with on a daily basis, our collaborative partners, very qualified, were not funded. The strength, however, is that it was a fair process because all of us had the opportunity to go through the same systems. The RFP was demanding, but we had the opportunity to present the written documents. We had the opportunity to go through the oral, and then agencies had the right to go through the comprehensive appeals process. I would recommend that since the system has been the same for all of us, if the integrity of the process has been ensured, that we move forward with the approval of the process.
Thank you. Brenda? She left? She stepped out? Okay. All right. I'll call her name again in a few minutes, see if she wants to comment on general public comment. When and if she gets back. Okay. So with that, Brenda, you're up.
I'm sorry. Hello, Councilman. I'm Brenda Shockley. I'm the president of Community Build. We are one of the 6 groups recommended for the funding under the grid. We're designated for the Baldwin Village area. I actually wanted to say 2 things. The first is that the last time I was here, it was when we were actually sort of formally transitioning out of the Ellie Bridges program and understanding that we were going to go through this process for the grid. And at that time, we were a group of colleagues who had worked together for over 10 years in our respective schools, and I can say that it's an honor to have worked with all of them and everyone. We went from there to having to become competitors. With the reorganization of the way the funding was designed, coupled with the designation of the grids, it put so many of us in a position where we had to compete with people we highly respect. And it only sort of comes to mind that not unlike tomorrow when they start the Olympics, that there is going to ultimately always be one group, one is a winner and someone is a runner-up. Community Build has been, I guess you could say, almost a victim on the one hand and a beneficiary on the other, because we submitted for 2 areas. We were selected for one. We had an interview, and were among those interviewed for the second. We were not selected. If you were to ask me, yes, I believe that we had the most competitive application in both cases, but the system and the nature of the competition was clearly defined. The expectations of the RFP were clear, and because we are not in that position, we accept both the designation for the area, and we also accept the fact that we were not selected in another. I say all that to say, and my time is up, that I do believe that the RFP was clear, that it was rigorous, and the most unfortunate aspect of it is that other fine organizations, because of the lack of funding, and communities that continue to need those funds, because there are not sufficient resources, that everyone who should be served is not being served. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have Liz Herrera.
Good afternoon. I'm the Executive Director of Arniedo Family Centers, and we were recommended for funding in the Pacoima grid area, and I just want to say we're very pleased and honored for that recommendation. And I also want to comment on the process and also comment on all of the agencies that applied for funding. We recognize the important work of all of the agencies, particularly the agencies in the area that we serve. So, you know, we certainly are very interested in partnering with the agencies as we move forward. I do want to say that I think that the process, as the previous speaker stated, was a fair and rigorous application process. I believe the strength that we brought to the table was the broad-based community collaboration that we engaged in, Arniedo as the lead, but the Pacoima Charter Initiative, which is a broad-based community effort that has been existing in Pacoima for some time. So I think the strength of that collaboration really did set our application apart. But I do want to say that I think the process was very fair and a rigorous process, and I do ask that the committee move forward on the recommendations. Thank you.
Aida Cerda and Ellen Sanchez.
Yes, hello. My name is Aida Cerda. I'm the Director of Youth Violence and Gang Prevention at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. We were awarded the bid for the Cypress Park Northeast Zone. And
So far you've been recommended.
Recommended, and we've been saying that publicly, actually recommended. Okay. And Councilmember Reyes, if I had a copy of the proposal, I would be glad to provide it to you right away. We just want to say that with some of this competitive process, we also believe it was a fair process, and we actually had an opportunity to reach out to agencies in the zone, like Aztecs Rising, and I had opportunities to try to collaborate with those agencies before we actually submitted our proposal in the hopes that we could actually do partnerships. But a number of organizations had already submitted their, had already identified the partners, so we submitted and we're in competition with each other, but we recognize that. We recognize and acknowledge the expertise of people like Aztecs Rising and El Centro de Pueblo, but also feel we're well positioned to provide the services in the zone. Even though we don't have a site at Cypress Park, we service a lot of youth in that community in our mental health programs, in our substance abuse programs, and also in our teen parenting program, which also includes an intensive home visitation. So I think the thing that puts us, that kind of we were excited about, was we also have experts in the science of prevention. We work with physicians, psychologists, social scientists. Dr. Leslie Clark is going to be part of our initiative, who has some really strong evidence-based practices that have been promising with other populations we've worked with, and also specialize in adolescent risk reduction. So we also would like to see this proposal move forward for final recommendations.
Wesley Clark, that's not that military guy, right?
No, this is Dr. Leslie Clark.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Not to be
Yes.
confused.
Your name for the record?
Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Sanchez, and I work with the Violence Intervention Program, which is also one that has been recommended as a lead agency for the prevention for the zone in Ramona Gardens, the Hollenbeck zone. And I want to comment on what an intelligent process I thought this was, in that the community needs assessment was such an important way to start, and that they were really, even that process was developed, bringing the community together to even develop the process and the needs assessment tools themselves. So what's exciting about this to us is that it is so immersed in the community, and the program that we're designing with our partners, Barrio Action in El Sereno, we're in Lincoln Heights, and Legacy LA, which represents Ramona Gardens, is that it's bringing together agencies that have been working, at least Violence Intervention Program and Barrio Action, for decades in their respective neighborhoods, with really strong expertise in working with the community, and then getting those agencies to address the needs that have come out in the needs assessment is just, it's a new process and a very intelligent process, and one that promises to be really effective. The Legacy LA is a group that is that is made up of representatives from Ramona Gardens. So though it's a new group, it's strongly driven by the community, and that's what this process has encouraged so much. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm going to need Richard Bob to come up again, and then also Jeff, if you can come forward. I was looking at my notes, and there's something that I've dealt with various levels of my responsibilities as a public servant, and this is something that is very misunderstood by the public. It's even misunderstood by policymakers. This is something that's misunderstood by the press. Unfortunately, I think the press has fun with this sometimes at the expense of overshadowing the real issues. And that is, I noticed that one of the recommended organizations is Los Angeles Metropolitan Churches. Mm-hmm. And the issue that I want to make sure that we have some dialogue on the record is about the separation of church and state. I understand that religious faith-based organizations do get funding to do services in communities at the federal level, at the state level, municipal levels, all around the country. But people always, and I think mostly in their ignorance, assume that, wait a minute, you can't do that. They're a religious organization. They're a faith-based organization. That on the surface does not preclude them from getting public dollars. But the kinds of activities that they engage in with those public dollars, that's where the organizations and also the funders need to understand that they both understand what their limitations are as far as engaging in secular faith-based activities with those dollars. So what are we doing, or what do we do as a city to make sure that is adhered to?
Well, I believe Los Angeles Metropolitan Church is actually a non-sectarian 501c3 umbrella organization. So they're actually the grant recipient of these dollars. Any churches that would be a part of that umbrella providing services, obviously none of those dollars could be used for sectarian purposes. And so I think the fundamental thing for them to be is on their subcontractors is just to be able to demonstrate that there's an appropriate firewall between, if they were subcontracting with a church, that there was a firewall between their sectarian activities and their non-sectarian activities along this line. So that certainly would be one of the things as we monitor their contract that we would be watching for and ensuring that they have an appropriate firewall between those two.
So to the city attorney, then what we seem to be generally doing in the city is assuming that if an organization has any ties, or if any of the providers within our contracts are in fact clergy or what have you, that they, I guess we're assuming, or we have them attest to, or do they, the fact that they understand that firewall that they need to create within their activities?
There's actually some standard language that's in all of our grant-funded contracts that talks about...
Including these?
Including these. That talks about what activities, if you are a church or if you are not. It goes into every single contract, that you may not proselytize, you may not discriminate, you may use your church facilities for these facilities. You don't have to cover up any religious artifacts, but you can't use them as a basis of encouraging people to join your church.
Okay.
It's a multi-paragraph section of all of our contracts.
So for example, if somebody is engaging in a group discussion and it is clearly a program funded, say by this grant or by this contract, excuse me, and say there's 6 people and the person conducting that group discussion is a clergy, it's on a church setting, assembly of whatever they call themselves, ABC Church, and they're engaging for an hour or what have you, and then the hour's over, it would be a violation of that trust for that clergy to say, now let's pray,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
But if it's over, what have you, and say one of the 8 people breaks down crying, they have a moment, and they ask of that person, can you pray with me? That's not a violation, is it?
As long as the time was over, it would not be a violation, correct?
But also isn't some of that, well, even if the hour's over, that clergy should not, in the continuum of that contact with that person, say, now let's pray.
Correct.
But if the other person, the constituent, they're the ones that initiate that want or that ask, that's not a violation, is it?
It's not a violation as long as it's after hours. See, there are 2 prongs here. One is it being after hours, and one is that it's initiated by the participant rather than the provider.
Now, if it's within that hour and the participant goes ahead and makes that ask, then that clergy needs to be disciplined enough to say, that individual, whether they're clergy or not, needs to say, you know what, Joe, or whatever, say, Joe, I'll talk to you later.
Absolutely.
Right? But within that hour, the person can't say, when the hour's over, everybody, remember, we're going to pray together. That would be a violation.
Correct.
Okay. So the reason why I'm having this discussion with you is because it is complicated, but there is some simplicity to it as far as the black and white of what is considered appropriate when you're utilizing public funds and inappropriate and unacceptable when using public funds.
Correct.
Good thing is,
regardless of what the faith is.
Correct.
Yeah, go ahead.
just going to say, the good thing is there are those in our office who have a little experience with that.
Exactly. And for the record, I've met many times with Jeff Carr, and we both share certain aspects of our spiritual beliefs. We've never asked each other to pray when we're in the building. So just in case anybody wants to make a big deal of that. So.
And if you made any request as such, since I am a minister, I couldn't divulge that anyway because of confidentiality issues. So.
But I'm not a minister, so I'm saying for the record. Okay. And I've never been accused of one either. I've been accused of giving long sermon-like speeches, but that's another story. But never clergy. So with that, I want to double-check. We do not have a quorum of this committee. Time is of the essence on this matter. I just want to be careful before I announce what the actions of this committee are. The fact that we're not a majority and we need and anticipate that this will go to council on next Friday, I don't want to say anything that would require a secondary vote or a delay of it getting out of council. So if I were to make a recommendation as a minority committee, as a recommendation of the chair, which is the custom and practice of our committees, if I were to state that, would that make any additional requirement on the council? Could it be, if we get a majority vote of the council, the required votes of the council, would it be disposed of that day and leave the council?
There's nothing that would prevent it. It'll take 10 votes to consider the matter on Friday, and then so long as they vote in favor, then it can go forward. There's nothing extra.
Okay, because there was an action of one of the committees that I was on, which was as a minority, we were warned by the CLA of that committee that it would require, it may impose a delay at the council level, a full council session level. Okay, all right. Since it looks good, okay. So it is the recommendation of the chairman of this committee that we approve the CAO recommendations. So that concludes item 1 of this committee. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And in addition to that, I do not see any general public comment cards for this committee. Is there anybody here for general public comment of this committee at this time? Seeing and hearing none, general public comment for this committee is now closed. With that, this committee is now adjourned.